For our next session, we're going to hear from Barry Lynn, who's the director of the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative. So he owns the R word here at New America, the initiative here at New America. He's the author of End of the Line, The Rise and Coming Fall of the Global Corporation. Then we're going to hear a presentation from Rob McNish, who's a principal of corporate finance and strategy practice at McKinsey & Company. They're going to have two very different talks, and then followed by a short conversation with Matt Iglesias, who is the business and economics correspondent at Slate Magazine and the author of the recently published The Rent is Too Damn High. We have put on this segment the title for this is Resilient Capitalism, How to Thrive in the Face of Disruptive Change, and that will encompass both presentations and the conversation. And I should just note that this was something that we did in kind of editing today's program, so it's not the title for each talk, and I think Barry and Rob might be quick to point that out, and so their conversations will take us in different directions, and I now present to you Barry Lynn. Thanks.
Thanks, Andres, and thanks for all you coming out today. And this is I've been working on resiliency for about 10, 12 years, and it's somewhat of a different take than some of the earlier things you've heard today, because it's kind of looking at resiliency in terms of systems, in terms of engineered systems, and sort of to get a sense about actually what I'm talking about. I think it helps to sort of start out by looking at a couple of engineered systems, which are ships. And now the first ship is a ship that was launched in about 1858, and it's a ship that was called the Great Eastern. And this at the time was the most advanced ship any place in the world. It was said to be unsinkable. It was built with a double hull. It had a stem to stern bulkhead deck. It had three modes of propulsion. And it turned out to be actually unsinkable. In about 1862, that ship hit a rock off of Montauk Point. That even to today, that rock is called the Great Eastern Rock. And that rock ripped a hole 90 feet long and about 10 feet wide in the hull of that ship. And that ship stayed afloat. They got it into port, they fixed it, and it spent another 30 years going back and forth across the Atlantic laying cable. The other ship you may recognize was launched about 50 years later. That's called the Titanic. Now, you know that they left a few things out of that ship, such as, there weren't quite enough lifeboats on that ship. They also left out the double hull, and they also left out the bulkhead deck. The thing about when Ballard's crew got down to the bottom of the ocean back in the 1990s and they looked at the hull of this ship, one of the things they found out is that unlike what people thought they were going to find, there was really no gash. It was just kind of an area on the front part of the ship where the plates had been buckled. The actual amount of the hull was about 1/20th of the total space of the hole that had been ripped in the Great Eastern hull. The water had come in, not in a huge rush, but it kept coming in. And the problem was that the first ship had 14 different compartments. Titanic also had compartments, but the top ship had a bulkhead deck. That means every single compartment was enclosed. The bottom ship, the Titanic, it had gotten rid of that bulkhead deck, so when that water is seeping in through the front of the ship, when it got to the top of the compartment, it spilled into the next compartment. And then it spilled into the next compartment, and all of a sudden that ship just went straight down to the bottom. So the lesson is that in the first ship, in the Great Eastern, a disaster in one place, it was built so you could keep that disaster in that one place. You could localize that disaster. That ship was a resilient system. Second ship, disaster in one place, because there was no ability to localize that disaster, becomes a disaster every place. That is not a resilient system. So anyway, I mean, really, human beings are actually pretty good at building resilient systems. We do it with And a resilient system is something that it's when there's a shock, you're able to dampen that shock. You're able to distribute the shock. You're able to compartmentalize the shock. You're able to localize the disaster. We did it with electrical systems. We have circuit breakers. We do it with large jets. We have multiple engines on those jets. So if something goes wrong, you got another engine. We do it with flood control. Not so well in perhaps in New Orleans, but pretty well most everywhere else. We do it with the internet. This is a picture of resilient systems. This is Paul Barron's sort of draft of a picture of what the internet might look like. This is from 1960. So we're pretty good at figuring out how not to put all our eggs in one basket, but not always. So just to sort of see how sometimes we don't do a very good job of distributing risk, I'm going to tell a story about what happened after an earthquake in Taiwan in 1999, in September 21 of that year. It was actually a pretty big quake. It was about 7.6 magnitude, killed about 2,500 people. But that was on the other side of the world. What was interesting is what happened after that, which is just a few days later. In the United States, all these factories suddenly shut down. As it turned out, the reason that all these factories in the United States suddenly shut down is because that part of Taiwan, there was actually a town about an hour outside of Taipei called Hsinchu. And in this town of Hsinchu, it turned out that almost all of a certain kind of semiconductor came out of that one town. And they'd stick it on airplanes, they'd fly it across the ocean, and then put it into all those computers and other products and all those factories all around the United States. So what happened, luckily, that town was not affected by the earthquake. What happened, the earthquake knocked out power to the airport, couldn't fly the ships in and out, so within a few days, the system went down. Sort of to understand what this meant, though, what this was, what we had is a single point of failure. So that when you lose that, when there's a failure at that one point, you lose the whole system. So the system in which products are moving around, in which component A is connecting to component B, to component C, to component D, and then at the end of the day, all of these nations have the product. Suddenly you get to a point where it doesn't happen. No one has the product. But anyways, like what we saw back in 1999, that was the world's first industrial crash. So, and unfortunately, it was not the last crash. We saw sort of seizures of industrial systems after September 11. We were paying attention to something else at the time, but what also happened during that, just in the days right afterwards, is that a number of industrial systems essentially ground to a halt. We saw it during the SARS epidemic in 2003. There were major disruptions in supply systems. There were, in 2002, the Indians and the Pakistanis were threatening to throw nuclear weapons back and forth at each other. One of the things that companies like GE and Citibank realize is that all of that capacity for processing information that they've stuck down in South India, if there's any kind of event that would take these two nations offline, they don't get to import that information anymore in real time. And that means that companies like GE and Citibank might go black for at least a period of time. The most dramatic industrial crash happened last year. This was after what the Japanese call the triple disaster, which was the earthquake and the tsunami and then the Fukushima sort of nuclear disaster. Now, it's important to understand sort of the magnitude of the disruption from this industrial crash. In Japan, most of the industry in the country is located in the south, in places around Osaka and then further to the west. Up in the north, where this happened, there was very, very, very little industry. Yet, what we saw is truly phenomenal. This is a drop-off in the amount of activity, industrial activity, production activity, in the period right after the quake. Now, this compares. There was a very to understand how the world is changing, in 1995, there was a very devastating quake right in Kobe, in the heart of their industrial area. And what we ended up with at that point was a relatively minor, at the time it seemed big, but it was about a little, 3% drop. And here we have a quake way to the north, way outside the zone of central production, and you have a truly massive blow to the system. And I just want to emphasize, it's not only, sort of these hard industrial systems, electronics. What we see is, just just so we understand, the Japanese quake, the other thing that we saw from that is that it was a synchronized event in multiple countries. We saw that, what we just saw here, that's a drop-off in activity in Japan. At the same time that happened, we saw really significant drops in activity in pretty much every industrialized country in the world, in North America, in Europe. And this is actually a quote from a Reuters article at that time. And what they said is, we've seen a remarkably synchronized worldwide economic slowdown due to this event. And then at the same time, it's like, here's an event, again, it's on the other side of the world, and here in the United States, the result was, and this is another quote, this is about 3 months after the event, this was from an article that came out in early June of last year. The Philadelphia Fed sees the largest 3-month drop ever in production activity. This is because of an event on the other side of the world. So it's not only heavy industrial, it's not only electronics, but one of the things we've seen is that, say, vitamin C, which is also called ascorbic acid. There's the number of products, of components that where, like that chip that was in Taipei, in Taiwan, in Hsinchu, the number of components where we see massive concentration of production, of capacity in one place, every day the list grows longer every day. Vitamin C, which is also called ascorbic acid. It's something that we put into pretty much every packaged food in the United States. We use it to preserve the foods. The vitamin C was the molecule was first identified by an American scientist. It was first synthesized by an American scientist. It was first mass-produced by an American company. Today, 100% of the vitamin C that we use in this country comes out of China. If any break in supply, we don't have this thing that we use in all of our packaged food systems. Drugs, the chemicals that go into our drug systems, I mean, the drugs are often manufactured here, but the actual chemicals, 90% of those chemicals come out of China. DRAMs, 70% of the DRAM factory. You think people might have learned something from the Taiwan quake in 1999. Today, about 70% of all the DRAM production is located in and around, actually, essentially in one place outside of Seoul, about 30 miles from the DMZ. What could this mean? It would mean if a large disruption, potentially catastrophic disruption, it would mean potentially huge hit in the number of jobs that we have here. But it could also mean, obviously, disruptions in our drug supply systems, disruptions in our food supply systems. This medical masks, after the SARS scare of 2003, I have a friend out in Minnesota named Michael Osterholm. He's an epidemiologist. Minnesota is also a place where you got 3M. So Michael realized that there was something here, even though he's an epidemiologist, he realized that the disruptions of these systems could be actually a bigger problem than the sickness itself. And to prove this to himself, he went and he knocked on the door of 3M, and he said, well, how do you make these masks that we rely on? And what they said is, well, this is actually a beautiful thing. In the old days, we used to have this big pile of raw material, and then we had a factory in which you had these machines in series, and then at the end, we had a big warehouse with all the stuff ready to go, months of supply sitting in one place. And now what we've done is we have transformed the system. It's all lean. It's all just in time. We bring the components in from Asia. We put them together lickety-split. We ship them out immediately. There's no waste any place in the system. And then Michael asked these guys, he goes, well, what if there were any break in the supply of goods coming from Asia, say because of SARS, because people are now allowing these planes to fly back and forth? And these people who actually make these masks said, you know, we actually have never thought about that. You know, it's not only industrial systems, big and small. It's also banking. You know, you've heard about too big to fail, too integrated to fail. You know, it's essentially the same flaw and principle that we see in the banking system. We also see it in monetary systems. The European monetary system, right now we're dealing with this, a situation in which the adoption of the euro by multiple countries has eliminated all the flexibility, all the resiliency that used to exist in that system for people to adjust to meet different changes in the economic performance. So, why are some systems less resilient than others? You know, is it something to do with the nature of the system? Is it perhaps something to do with, you know, something that's inherent in the character of capitalism? Or is it something else? You know, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump ahead to, right straight to two answers, and then I'm going to explain why these two answers fit. And the first answer is monopolization. And this I would define as when people use the business corporation to capture control over some activity, some production activity in this case. And then they often, in the process of capturing control over that activity, they will concentrate actual capacity in one or a couple places. The other answer is mercantilism. And mercantilism is essentially when people use the corporation that we call the nation state to do the same thing as people use the private business corporation to do, which is to capture control, exercise power in ways that allow you to capture control over some activity, and often to concentrate that capacity. So you end up with all of one thing in Hsinchu and Taipei, all the DRAMs near Seoul. So, you know, just now to explain exactly how this happens, I'm just going to really very briefly look at sort of the nature of the industrial system, the old structure of the industrial system. This here is like sort of depicts how the automotive system looked around 1990. It was vertically integrated. Each corporation pretty much did everything underneath it. Every corporation had its own windshield wiper manufacturer, its own manufacturer of alternators, et cetera, et cetera. By, say, about 2005, outsourcing, every one of these companies had broken apart from their supply base, and in the process of breaking it apart from the supply base, they basically left their supply base open to those who would concentrate control over certain activities. So now, in some cases, we have two companies that dominate the worldwide production of windshield wipers. We have two companies that dominate the worldwide production of piston rings, as opposed to having 5, as I saw there, and actually maybe more like 20 in reality. This is sort of a picture of industrial nations circa 1990. The industrial nations circa 1990 were these were vertically integrated. Those were systems to make cars. There was not a lot of movement of product, of components from the United States to Japan or to Germany. And then what we have now is this. And the difference between 1990 and 2005 is we saw what was called offshoring, which is the breaking apart of the vertically integrated nation state. So, and that of course leads to a system that functions like that. So anyway, to end up, some systems are less resilient than others because they are poorly engineered. or actually more accurately in the case of these systems that I'm describing, they were really never engineered as systems, even though they are systems. Now, the reason that we have this bad engineering is essentially a function of bad politics, bad political decisions. And I'll just, there's a lot of bad political decisions we made in this country and around the world last 30 years. I'll just name two that are directly pertinent to the systems that we're looking at. 1981, we essentially got rid of antitrust in this country. For 200 years, we had antitrust, for better or worse, and a monopoly law. 30 years ago, we got rid of it. No one has looked at how that affects the functioning of these systems. Other change, 1994, the approval of the General Agreement, the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which led to the WTO. That took 200 years of experience in terms of using your border to distribute your reliance in other countries, and threw it out the door. It opened the door to radical concentration of power over certain activities by the Chinese, also by the Koreans, also by the Taiwanese, increasingly by the Germans. Those two political decisions, probably more than any others, allowed for a few people to essentially put all our eggs in one basket, or to create these single points of failure. The result, is essentially we now are dependent upon an industrial system that is not resilient. It is brittle, and it becomes more brittle every day. It is built to break. And just so we know what we missed in terms of our opportunity, back in the 1990s, when we began to offshore, when we began to outsource, we could have exercised power, mind, upon those processes in ways that would have led to a far, far more distributed system, a far more resilient system, where a shock anywhere, we could have isolated it and localized it. Instead, we now have a system that is built to transmit shock instantly, and even to amplify that shock. So this, I got to move on here, but solutions, don't have time for the solutions. You'll have to come back for that. Yeah. But there are solutions, and actually the good news is that they're actually relatively simple, but they're entirely political in nature. Anyway, thank you.
All right. My name is Rob McNish. I'm a partner with McKinsey & Company based in Washington, D.C. And based on the other topics here today, I would call myself the knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing capitalist in the crowd. And I'd like to talk to you from our experience in how corporations are or are not resilient in the face of what we would call disruptive change, not the normal everyday pace of change, but things that really require a corporation to respond dramatically if it's to be successful. I guess I've got the control here. So first, not to belabor the point, but many people believe that a number of global forces have increased or accelerated the pace of change, or the number of events of dramatic change that impact corporations, among them globalization, some of the things that Barry talked about, technology and innovation, liberalization, which you all talked about, higher velocity, faster cycle times, and a profound distribution of fortune between winners and losers, winner takes all, and concentration, as he mentioned, and therefore brittleness in the system. A chart I don't have, but would have been a nice complement to Barry's discussion, is one that other people I think call the Great Moderation, and sort of the reversal of that. A period of about 20, 25 years from roughly the end of the 80s until the early 2000s, when we as a global economy experienced inherently lower volatility. You almost look at anything, volatility in commodity prices, volatility in distributions of market shares, volatility in stock price movements. They all moderated during that period. And many of the trends that Barry was talking about were exploited and pursued during that great moderation. We made supply chains more brittle. We made business models more brittle, largely in economic response to a lower cost of risk from this great moderation of risk. Risk is now back. If you look at the charts, the Great Moderation has reversed itself to more normal historical periods, and those decisions are looking less wise. Now, when those decisions were being made, many were made unconsideredly. Others that were made on a considered basis were made in the context of lower volatility, and they made sense at the time. I'll pursue slightly lower average costs in my supply chain and supply network because the risk of failure is smaller or less expensive. Now that the risk of failure is larger and more expensive, those decisions look poor, and that's why you see people talking about bringing things back home, right, to manufacture here, and why you see in our supply chain practice more and more people requalifying second and third and fourth suppliers, whereas before they had concentrated their supply on one person. So people are reversing these decisions slowly and painfully over time. I'm going to take it up a level, though, and talk about overall corporate resiliency. And this chart represents a fairly simple analysis of how resilient or how sustainable leaders are in their industry over time. And the chart depicts the percentage probability that a company in the top fifth of its industry in one year, 5 years later, has lost that position of being in the top fifth. And in 1975, if you were in the top fifth of revenues in your industry in 1975, you had roughly an 8% chance 5 years later of not being in the top fifth. Relatively modest turnover in the top quintile of companies in any given industry. More recently, if you were in the top quintile in 1997 at the right-hand side of this chart, you had more like a 30 or 32% chance of not being in the top quintile 5 years later. So there's many ways of describing the same phenomenon, but the turnover rate, the churn rate of successful companies has dramatically accelerated over the last 30 years or so. You see this in members of the S&P 500, members of the Dow 30. Well, not the Dow 30. That's pretty stable, but you see a lot more change. Why are few successful companies able to navigate what we would call disruptive change? Most of these answers are pretty straightforward, right? They respond late, either because they don't see it or they're calcified and can't react to it. It's tough. It's hard to know what to do. If you see it and want to respond, sometimes it's hard to figure out what to do. And there's a lot of uncertainty in making the change and a lot of internal conflict in organizations. Often we find companies making incremental responses, the frog in boiling water problem. I think this water might just be a little warmer, let me respond a little bit, but actually no, it's going to boil and you better move quickly. And sometimes you just made bad choices, right? You don't know. You choose to move in a certain direction and it was wrong. Let me move toward the realm of answers. When we synthesize our research around navigating disruptive change successfully, the answers tend to fall into three categories for us from a manager's point of view. The first I'll call refocusing the portfolio. And the message here is that strategic insight matters and strategic bold leadership matters. Seeing what's happening, figuring out what's going on, figuring out what the possible responses are to it, and then acting boldly is a big key to adapting and being resilient as an organization. So this is, the value of the team at the top, of reaching strategic insight and making a big move, and being bold in its refocusing of resources, which in a corporate environment is very difficult to do, because reallocating resources means calling winners and losers, and that means resisting an organization that doesn't want to be on the losing end of the resource reallocation. Second effective response comes from what we would call transforming the core. This is about fundamentally changing the business model and the way things operate today in your core businesses. And here are the key messages around organizational structure and organizational complexity and organizational resilience. And I'll give you an example of that shortly. The third factor in success is what we call building new businesses. Well, in response to change, things are going to die. And if you just let it happen to you and pieces of your business die and you don't replace it with new things, then the organization slowly dies and you end up in a downward spiral. So an organization's ability to accelerate its pace of growth and innovation and newness is a really big part of responding to disruptive change. It's sort of realizing that some things are going to go away and I need to replace them. And as an overall entity, if you don't replace the things faster than the things that are going away, you die. And here I'll talk about the importance of culture, people, and incentives. And let me do some of this by talking about a case example of Unilever and Procter & Gamble. So let's bring it right down to selling soap and talk a bit about, I'll focus my remarks mostly on Procter & Gamble because I hate talking about companies negatively, and Procter & Gamble is the positive part of this battle. Let's talk about the late 1990s, a number of things that were hitting the consumer goods sector, particularly in the product categories represented by P&G and Unilever. There were a proliferation of brands trying to share the same pie. Consumer goods companies noticed that brands mattered, that differentiating brands allowed them to price differentiate, and therefore they proliferated brands, but it led to a tremendous amount of complexity and cost and potential confusion in the system. Most importantly, the second chevron here, channel power was consolidating. Retail was consolidating. The rise of Walmart was creating a player in the supply chain that had dramatic power over players like P&G and Unilever. These companies were traditionally used to using retailers as rented space, is sort of the business model. The hierarchy of power changed, and Walmart began using P&G and Unilever as suppliers. So the balance of power in the system fundamentally changed through consolidation and the success of the Walmart business model. We had evolving consumer needs. I won't belabor some of these. Shift away from traditional media, right? The internet, moving away from normal modes of advertising, broadcast television and print. And then we had obviously some investor concerns or considerations around who was getting capital and who wasn't getting capital. While the dot-com boom was going, companies like these were not getting capital, and then when it bust, no one was getting capital. In response to these changes, Unilever and P&G both launched growth programs. Right? They saw it. Their bottom or the top line was coming down. Sales were actually falling for the first time in a long, long time, and their stock price was getting hit dramatically. It got the attention of the executive teams, and both of them said, in response to this, we need to change and we need to grow. Both developed fairly sophisticated growth programs and then launched them in 2000, 2001. And regardless, so Unilever called theirs the Path to Growth, and P&G called it their Organization 2005 campaign. They were fundamentally different in nature. The Unilever approach was biased toward improving the profitability of the current business, and the P&G approach was wired more in the vein of creating new capabilities and making the organization more flexible, more complex, but more flexible. Both were directed at trying to regrow the organization, but their approaches were quite different. I'll dig into P&G a little bit. So this is a P&G chart. I didn't put the logo up, I forgot. Back to that refocusing the portfolio. What this chart represents is the mix of revenue in the P&G portfolio by division or by product line, from food all the way down to healthcare, and how that evolved between 1999 and 2005. Now, if you draw this chart for 100 random companies in the S&P 500, you usually find it to be a lot more static than this. This doesn't look like a lot of change, but in a corporation as large as P&G, this is a dramatic amount of change in terms of what parts of their portfolio are growing and which parts are shrinking. This represents a very bold, top-down executive initiative to say, we're going to double down in beauty care and health care, and we're going to de-emphasize food and baby and family and fabric and home care. Those are very difficult decisions for corporations to make, and this is very bold. This was top-down leadership, and it was A.G. Lafley. A.G. Lafley was named chairman right around this time. In fact, it was his plan, before he was CEO and chairman, that was put into effect as CEO and chairman. In fact, his plan got him the job. And his approach to doing business was appropriate for this time. He's a bold strategic decision maker. And he said, we need to make clearer the tough strategic choices and act on them, focus on leading brands, and focus on leading products, and focus on leading countries. So he said, we're doing an awful lot of stuff. we need to focus on where we're winning. And that was a difficult strategic choice to make because it created a lot of losers in his organization, people who didn't get the resources. Shifted mix, focused on big countries. Let me talk a bit about organization. Now, I don't expect you to care about this chart, but what it means is on the left-hand side, you see a bad representation of a classic matrix organization structure. P&G had a matrix organization structure, and if you've ever lived inside of one, they're enormously frustrating. They are expensive, they are slow, sometimes they are wasteful, accountabilities are overlapping, right? But in the face of dramatic change, it worked. The organization structure here has regions to it, it's got product lines to it, and it's got functions to it. Think of a three-dimensional cube with those three dimensions as the organization structure. Unilever had a classic, largely single-dimension organization structure with regional operating units and then sub-regional operating units within it, and then product lines were embedded within that. But in the P&G structure, product lines, geographies, and functions were all at the same level of the organization, battling in a matrix. And in Unilever, it was a lot more lockstep hierarchy of region down to sub-region, then down to product. The P&G model proved much more resilient in this time period because there was a lot of uncertainty, and the matrix model forces cross-functional collaboration, cross-regional collaboration, and a lot of discussion among managers before they decide what to do. And that led to better problem solving and better direction setting. The result was pretty clear. Over the subsequent 5 years after both those programs were launched, P&G grew at 6%, Unilever shrank, and TRS is the total return to shareholders. This is if you had invested $1, what would it be worth? In P&G, you would have experienced a 6.2% per annum return. In Unilever, you would have lost 4.3% a year over this 5-year period. So the results were pretty stark in the different approaches. Now, the good news for Unilever is that it's an intelligent, capable organization, and they realized within about 4 or 5 years that they needed to rechange the approach. And they adopted, in 2005, an approach that wasn't exactly like P&G's, but it had some of the same elements. A lot more focus, calling of winners and losers, shifting of resources, and major changes to the organization that increased the complexity of the organization, but made it more adaptive and more resilient. And those are my charts.
Well, sir, thank you for two great presentations. I thought I would kick this off just by asking Barry what seemed like the obvious question to me watching that presentation is that we can see clearly that there are some problems here, that there are some downsides to concentrating your supply chain, but why is it that we shouldn't just assume that companies, corporate leaders will be able to look at this, see, well, what's the cost involved in diversifying my supply chain, but what's the benefit, and kind of make the shift in response to these kind of events you're talking about? What is the political problem here as opposed to simply a corporate strategy problem for business leaders to think through on their own terms?
That's a great question, and it's one I've been dealing with for 12 years now. And because what we have here is essentially a million rational decisions, a million people going out and doing exactly the right thing according to the environment of law in which they find themselves. And then it all adds up to a system that, if you step back and look at it from the point of view of society as a whole, is grotesquely engineered. And so you do have a number of people who do make wise decisions. You have some companies that are, as Rob was saying, are making this effort to, find the second, find the third, find the fourth supplier, to force those suppliers to distribute their production. But there's actually two problems with this. A number of these efforts tend to run out of steam after a short period of time. And I spent the summer of 2008 in Japan, and I was looking at the effects of an earthquake that had taken place the previous summer in a town called Niigata, in which a single piston ring company got knocked out. So I spent a lot of time talking to Toyota, which dominates that system, and I spent a lot of time talking to the folks at Riken, who are the producer. And so Riken kept telling me, well, yes, they tell us that we have to spread around our machines. And it's easy to spread around the machines. These machines that you make a piston ring with are about this big. You could put them all under one roof, or you could put them under 10 roofs or 100 roofs. It's just a matter of cost. So they said, they keep telling us that we have to move them around, but they keep cutting our profits. So they're giving us two very different messages here. So so Toyota, even now, Toyota's saying we're going to dual source, triple source everything. We're going to remake the whole system. But I can tell you that is actually not happening in Japan. In fact, you're actually seeing more concentration in certain areas, such as the chips that go into cars. And actually, and one of the things that this is really a complicated issue, but it's really quite simple if you look at it, is that it's the issue of competitive risk. If I am at the top tier companies, the OEMs that are buying these supplies, they look at each other and it's like, what is the horizon of risk? If I make a bad decision today, a year from now, I'm out the door. I personally, the CEO of Unilever, am out the door if I make a bad decision. So if I invest in my company, making my company more resilient, well, if there's no event in between now and a year from now, I don't win. In fact, I've just added a cost with no benefit. Yeah. So unless the state comes in and basically makes this even and sort of sets a set of rules, you're not going to have any of these companies making the proper decisions on their own. They cannot do it.
Right, that was my question for you, is are financial markets and investors prepared to sort of have the patience that would be required for resilient strategies to pay off?
I believe they are, but it depends very much on the credibility that the management team has with their investors, and there's a broad spectrum on that. Managers who have a lot of credibility with their investors can carry the day in making decisions that are right for the long term and are right for decisions on a risk-adjusted basis rather than just a near-term basis. Managers who don't have that credibility end up falling into the traps that Barry's describing. I think corporations are not particularly good at making risk-adjusted decisions because of the way their incentives are organized, investor response just being one of those. They make good expected value decisions, and things like purchasing departments are notoriously held accountable for 2% year-on-year reductions in cost on an expected value basis. If they were making a risk-adjusted decision, they would recognize that over the next 10 years, this 2% that I gained by making my supply chain more brittle would come back and cost me 20% in year 7, and if I factor that probability in, then I wouldn't do it, right? But they're not incentivized that way. The second thing I'd say that organizations have had a hard time with is this great moderation I was talking about matured a generation of executives who were used to making decisions with relatively benign uncertainty environments. And they're having to relearn how to make decisions under uncertainty.
Well, that actually, I'm glad you used that word, because another question that occurred to me is, we draw a distinction, or people sometimes do, between quantifiable risks and unquantifiable uncertainties. And to an extent, I wonder, which is it that we're talking about here? It's one thing to ask companies to manage, known risks, but it's another to deal with the well, the existence of uncertainty in the world, that there are things that are sort of outside of a corporate planning horizon, it seems to me.
It's true. And then you enter into the realm of managerial judgment,
Right.
Which is what makes organization structure and culture so important. Because no existing management team, nor individual on the existing management team, by definition, knows what's coming down the pike. And so it's about initial response and then organizational humility and culture to say, ooh, our first response isn't necessarily the right one. How do we learn from that? So learning organizations more effective than hierarchical organizations.
I actually think that the way the system's set up right now, it's extremely unfair for the well-meaning corporate executive. I mean, I spent in my early days of figuring out what was going on here, I was guided in what I was doing by executive CEOs and large companies, in fact, who understood that the system was incorrectly engineered. They were very honest about it. They were gone into Washington, knocked on doors. What we see here is a failure of leadership in Washington. What we see here is a failure of leadership, of the willingness to actually open the door and hear news that is not pleasant, and to face up to the fact that some of the systems that we run, like the trade system, that some of the decisions that we made 15 years ago were wrong. So I think this is at no point is this a situation in which the corporate executives are the villain. To the extent that there is people are making bad decisions, it's not at that level.
So can you tell us, I think you got cut off for time reasons, but you had a slide which had headshots of some famous politicians. What were they about?
That was a number of politicians who were essentially small R Republicans. They were people, these are, if you go back to the beginning of the United States, the Tea Party, the actual Tea Party. What was the Tea Party? The Tea Party was not really about taxation. If you go back and look at what happened, the Tea Party was a rebellion against monopolization of commerce in this country by the British East India Company. So we were born out of a rebellion against monopoly, and that rebellion has been fought many, many times since then. So those people up there were some of the leaders who have stood up against concentrated power. First one on that list was Madison, but the last one was Eisenhower, who, as you remember in his farewell address, talked about the dangers of the military-industrial state. So if this is a case in which what we saw, the way I look at what happened in the world is essentially 1981, there was a form of coup within the political economic regime that we use to govern this country, govern political activity, economic activity in this country. And a system that had been designed to distribute power was overturned in favor of a system that celebrates efficiency foremost, and therefore not only turns a blind eye to monopolization and concentration, but actually celebrates it. So what we have now is, so those are if we go back to what we did well for 200 years, I think we'll go a long ways to fixing this problem.
So, I mean, I think it's indisputable that we are seeing more concentration in some respects, more winner-take-all markets. But at the same time, you showed a slide illustrating more instability. So, I wonder what do you think about this idea that there's a monopolization?
Well, I think that there's always a tendency toward monopolization. What we're talking about is how you safeguard against it, right? And the tendency is economic. The tendency is that it concentrates rent in the system to the person who achieves the monopoly power. And so there's always that motivation. And many markets function well because it's virtually impossible in competition to achieve that. Mm-hmm. Others, it's much easier to capture, right? Mm-hmm. And where it's easier to capture, that's the role of antitrust, right? I think that you're right. The chart I showed is that the guys on the top get toppled at an increasingly fast rate. I think that's a result of some of the forces I was describing that make it more important to adapt and be flexible. And large corporations are not inherently about adaptability and flexibility. They're about driving a winning model, right, home and around the world and across products. And those organizations are not really that flexible. And I think what I showed was that when they're not, they lose.
I mean, is there a winning model for companies that are trying to preserve flexibility in the face of that kind of disruptive change? I mean, is the moral of that P&G Unilever comparison that they had the right kind of corporate structure, or is it that faced with disruption, random factors prove to be beneficial in ways that you can't predict?
So I'd come back to sort of what I was harping on. Insightful strategic leadership. This is why some CEOs are worth every penny they get paid, because Lafley was. I don't know whether it was luck or skill on the organization structure. They happened to exist at that time with an organization structure that was better able to adapt to the things that hit them. It was a costly organization structure to maintain. Who knows whether it was a good cost benefit before the events happened. It was certainly a good cost benefit after. And I do believe in culture. An organization's willingness to see, talk about, and do something about risk without becoming parochial or defensive is a really big deal.
You know, I'd agree up to a large degree. Corporate executives can make their companies much more resilient up to a certain point. At which point you're dealing with a system that is not resilient, in which case everyone goes down. There's a famous case that sort of proves this. There was a fire back in 2000 in a semiconductor plant in New Mexico that was run by Philips. There was a radio frequency chip that plant was making that had been promised to two companies. One of those companies was called Nokia, the other was called Ericsson. When that fire happened, this was the only source of production for this radio frequency chip. When that fire happened, Nokia had a plan and Nokia moved fast. Ericsson didn't have a plan. Ericsson kind of sat around waiting for Philips to fix the problem. Nokia ended up with a little glitch in production. They got the little bit of space that was available at a different plant that was run by Philips. Ericsson ended up with a $500 million plus shortfall that year. They ended up the next year selling out their production to Sony. So it's like companies, executives absolutely can plan for shocks, but there are certain shocks, large geographic shocks, political shocks that no one at this point can plan for.
You know, I wanted to ask also about your presentation. How much of this really has to do with political decisions that are being undertaken in foreign countries? That a lot of Asian, mercantilist development strategies seem to lead to product specialization and intense clusters in a way that's perhaps out of our hands.
And that's actually one of the things I was going to say is there's another limit out there. There's a resistance. Anyone who wants to make their system more geographically resilient, like if you're sourcing all of some component and it's all coming out of South China, and you would actually like to move half of that into, say, Taiwan, you may run up against a state power that does not want you to do that, which is in Beijing. Now, but China is not the only mercantilist actor out there. What we've seen is sort of since over the last 15 years, you've seen all of these countries, the major industrial countries of Asia, go out and grab hold of certain components. The Japanese are very good at this. The Koreans are very good at this. The Taiwanese are very good at this. And once you have it, you do not let it go, unless another state is telling you to do so.
Huh. So, but it seems to me it's a tension in what you've been saying, that part of the rationale for the sort of global trade paradigm that we're moving to is precisely that those kind of measures are destructive, but that no one country wants to give them up, and that if you have a multilateral framework towards sort of dismantling these sorts of things, that in fact that would be how you would get to a more resilient dynamic, as opposed to the United States just sort of getting in on the game and grabbing our own particular corner of the supply chain.
Oh, yeah, no, it's very important. What I advocate, and I never advocate a vision of protectionism. In fact, if we go out and say, oh, we have to have this component produced at home, this component produced at home, that's not going to work. And the model I actually look at is ways you have to. There's the ideal vision, which is that we're going to turn it all over to the marketplace, and basically the corporate executives are going to distribute things in a relatively efficient and safe way. That runs into problems with the mercantilists. What is missing in the system right now is the U.S. state standing up and saying we're not going to be, as a nation, 100% dependent on China for vitamin C, for instance. We're not going to be 90% dependent on China for the chemicals that go in our drugs. So it's like, so the failure in Washington to say that, to use power to force the distribution of these activities, and when I say distribution, it doesn't mean that any of it comes home. If, in the case of vitamin C, you spread that out so that a quarter of the production's in Thailand, a quarter of the production's in Brazil, a quarter of the production is in Europe, and a quarter remains in China, that's a pretty safe system. None of that is in the United States. But you do need sanctions. You do need the force of a nation state standing up and saying, we will not have to stand for this kind of concentration of power over us.
International political trust busters.
Yeah.
So this idea of a great moderation has obviously proven to be, rather illusory. But how do you know, as an organizational leader, if you are experiencing resilient structures or if you're just experiencing a kind of, false dawn of risklessness? I mean, how could you tell?
Yeah, it's hard to know, right? Because I could tell you that the people who grew up in that environment didn't think they were in anything unusual, and it was 25 years long, and that was, for many executives, it was their entire experience. We've taken at our firm to articulating a notion of performance, or a notion of corporate activity and measurement of that activity with this lens of what we call performance and health. And performance is, how are you doing right now? And health is, how robust are you set up to do well in the future? And we and others have started to try to delineate how do you measure current health, which is really how do you predict a measurement of future performance under a range of uncertainty. And it's got a whole bunch of dimensions around it that are strategic, organizational, product, technology, right? Every aspect of the business system you can think about as having current performance and future health. And I think just explicitly calling that out and not just focusing on the here and now and saying, okay, but what about health? How are we going to do next year? Then you start looking at talent pipelines. How are we doing on campus with recruiting? You just kind of go back in your system. You know what predicts the future, and you pay attention on the precursors.
And I think with that, we're about out of time. So thank you both for your presentations, very interesting remarks.